What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Marvel Dark Ages by Tom Taylor. Yes, we are. And, yeah, man, this is... I have no idea what I'm going to title this video yet. I have no idea what I'm going to call it. But, yeah, so how many YouTubers do you guys know who are going to upload 2 videos on their own birthday? Who are going to work on their own birthday? So in basically the aftermath of the first video that we did, where in effect a constant EMP has been essentially blanketing the world and everything's gone dark. What this does is it leads to a war between, you could kind of call it the heroes and the villains, but not necessarily. So the way that Spider-Man narrates this, because again, Peter Parker's the one giving us this monologue, he says, after our world went dark, people were scared and grieving, and their fear turned into anger. There were wars fought over borders, resources, ideologies. It was chaos. Between the initial earthquakes, the loss of power, and the wars, billions of lives were lost. One of the best things about this, the way that Tom Taylor does it, and he does this routinely, whenever it comes to stories that he's writing that deal with like massive wars and things like that, it doesn't really fall down these ideologies of like heroes versus villains, right? Good guys versus bad guys. It just kind of falls down into the line of like desperation is really what it is. Because one of the things to know, and this is one of the cool things about Tom Taylor that I like, a lot of heroes are heroes because the circumstance simply allows it. But in times of desperation, people will believe what they want to believe. And so what happens when a hero loses everything they care about? When they lose their family or they lose their friends or something like that? It's very easy to lose that ideology of like, I am saving a world, especially when you look around and you see a world that doesn't look like it wants to be saved, or a world that simply won't save itself. It's very easy to walk away from that philosophy. The truth about this is that every single superhero, aside from just these cosmic entities or whatever, they're humans first and they're superpowered beings second, which means emotions, wants, needs, desires, all those things begin to take precedent. And that's why like resource wars, ideological wars, border skirmishes, all these things begin to take place, because those individuals who always saw themselves maintaining this kind of smaller place in the world now see the opportunity to expand out, right? There was a really cool story that I read years and years and years ago, and it doesn't have anything to do with comics, but it was talking about what would happen with a collapse of society. And what you would end up seeing are basically the rise of like petty warlords and like strongmen that would basically create these kind of small communities, and people would rally under them for some measure of protection. And that seems to be a lot of what you're seeing here. The difference is that where this war could have initially led to the falls, really to the ruin of all, what you end up getting is those who are truly altruistic, right? Those individuals out there who fight as superheroes because it's truly the right thing to do, actually step forward. Because Spider-Man says, but then cutting through all that fear, rage, and chaos came a voice of calm, and a message started to spread. It doesn't have to be like this. And this is one of the really cool things that you don't normally get to see, that you have all these heroes who come forward and they're like, we can be better than this, right? We can be better than like fighting border skirmishes and likely involving massive, weapons of mass destruction and things like that, because billions of lives being lost in a period of time, that's a pretty huge thing. And so you have like Laura Kinney, X-23, Wolverine, if you want to call her that, Black Panther, Shang-Chi, Deadpool. In his own unique way. Deadpool's actually amazing in this story. But you get these people who basically step forward, right? Kamala Khan. Right? And then, of course, you end up getting Captain America telling this guy, like, it doesn't have to be this way. And that's when you have the telepaths who really chime in and say, like, we can be better than this. And it's a really, really cool concept, because now there is no such thing as hero versus villain anymore, or at least that's the idea they're putting forward. It's simply just survivors. And that makes sense. That's usually what happens, right? It's not even an enemy of my enemy is my friend. It's I'm trying to survive, you're trying to survive, let's survive together. Because if we just keep going to war, we're all going to eventually die. And so what's taken place in the aftermath of all this, right? The 7 years that have followed since really these wars taking place and things like that, this kind of 7-year period since the EMP was initially started, is we're told that with a smaller population, without electricity, industrialization, and mass production, the world started coming back from the brink of like climate destruction. People fled the most inhospitable places and came to thriving centers. What was left of humanity sheltered from the darkness together. These super cities were each linked by a powerful telepath. So while the world was divided by distance, it was also connected by people who opened their minds and hid nothing from each other, all with a common goal. Now, this is a wildly utopian and super progressive and ideological concept. Would something like this ever truly come into pass? I don't know. probably hundreds, if not maybe a couple thousand years from now, assuming we as humanity don't obliterate ourselves off the face of the planet. Global war or something like that. But it's cool to see all these heroes and really just people with powers in general, humanity as a whole, casting aside the notions of like small-time differing factors and in turn uniting under a single common ideology. Because when you look at it for what it is, right, like borders between countries is kind of dumb. What separates a person in Mexico from a person in America? Nothing, except a border, right? Like we all are human beings, like we all have these personal mindsets when we want to like thrive and we want to succeed and we want to experience a better life. Cultural differences, sure, but there's really no reason why those things can't like coexist at the same time. And so what you end up getting here is basically this idea that Wakanda is essentially the leader of the world. We'll call it that. Wakanda conquer the world. But Wakanda is literally the capital city of Earth. It's not the capital city of like New York or like the United States or like New Wakanda or something like that, although the name New Wakanda does sound awesome. Instead, it's basically just a place. This is the capital place where seemingly the most important people reside and do the most important work. Now, one of the things that they've been focusing on here and they've been trying to achieve is trying to find a way to, at the very least, bring some measure of technology back. They can't necessarily reactivate or shut down that EMP because if they do, the Unmaker will show up. But in the end, what Peter tells us is that the center of our new world, Earth's capital, was Wakanda, a council of great theorists innovated every day in the city. Some of the best minds linked together by Jean Grey, Lunella Lafayette, Shuri, Tony Stark, Valeria Richards, T'Challa, Nadia Van Dyne, Amadeus Cho, and Victor Von Doom joined the greatest of the non-powered thinkers, which is kind of incorrect for Dr. Doom, although he doesn't inherently have power. He's like Doctor Strange, basically. They reimagined what the world could be. They dreamed up lighting and refrigeration, whole new systems of food production and preservation, shelter and governance. Together, they created a post-apocalyptic utopia. But how did we protect our utopia? We built webs. Now, this is a genius concept, right? It's a genius idea. And it really is kind of like Spider-Man and really the spider community living up to really their namesakes. That, as you guys know, when it comes to spiders, they have webbing, right? They have like spider's webs. And whenever something trips the spider's web, that's when it tells the spider there is a thing there which is usually there for me to eat, to consume, right? Something along those lines. But having that set up here, where webbing is all over the place, and there's no real way for anybody to access or really get within range of any of these cities without basically accessing webbing, because if they were to fly over it, somebody would notice, right? If they were to go underground, there's likely sensors and things like that they could use to detect it. And so having webbing set up, people are like, okay, something's going on. At that point, one of the webs snaps, and that's when they realize something's here, right? Like literally it rings a bell. And in doing so, while it is a primitive form of technology, it's exceedingly effective. And so the funny thing about this is that there's a conversation between Foggy Nelson and Daredevil where it's like, okay, like where was this? And Daredevil's like, well, it's over there, you know? And so he's like, should we send up a flare? And Foggy's like, no need, right? Like Wolverine will basically know by now. Laura Kinney has immediately picked up on the fact that somebody's there, and using her scent is able to essentially track them down. Not only that, what they've got here, and this is one of the cool things, what they've got here is Elsa Bloodstone, Blade, Gabby, who is the clone of Laura Kinney, and then Laura Kinney herself. This is basically the team you have when you're facing off against like supernatural threats, especially Elsa Bloodstone. She's really, really cool. And I'm really hoping they make a series about her at some point. But the reason why this team exists together is because in the absence of humanity just largely existing in unprotected cities, and with most of humanity taking refuge in protected cities, what it does is it leaves the landscape open for other predators to make their way out there in an effort to track and find humanity. Specifically, an alliance seems to have been struck between werewolves and vampires. And this is amazing because you literally have like all these guys teaming up. Now, whether or not this werewolf is Jack Russell, right, Werewolf by Night, I don't know if it is, and I don't think it is. We're not really told either way. They're dealt with pretty quickly, but one of the vampires actually manages to make their way into the laboratory of Tony Stark alongside Pepper Potts. And you have this voice kind of out of nowhere, this like, Tony Stark, like, I expected better of you. You'd think a brilliant inventor would invent a door. Only for us to find out it's Captain America. And it's cool to see that Steve Rogers has made it through all this stuff. You'd kind of expect him to, right? But it's cool to see that he did. But one of the things that goes on, and he basically talks talks about how he has largely been operating in Europe at this point because, in all honesty, like they were kind of afraid that like something had happened to him because he'd been gone for so long. That Iron Man has done really cool stuff, like he's mastered alchemy, the ability to turn like metal into gold, which is like really cool, specifically lead, really turn lead into gold, which is a pretty awesome concept. But at the end of the day, the whole idea of Captain America is he says like he's been in Europe this whole time and that it's still being ruled by an iron fist. And he says, they need help, Tony, like can we take a walk? We need your ability to step in and to basically deal with this. Now, one of the cool things about this is the relationship between Tony Stark and Captain America. Because on the surface, and those of you guys who've been reading Marvel Comics for a long time know that the relationship between Tony Stark and Captain America was always pretty strong until you got to Civil War. And then in the aftermath of Civil War, the relationship between the two was tenuous at best. Now, it's not to say things were perfect, right? It was not harmonious. Over the years in Marvel Comics, Tony Stark and Iron Man had always kind of butted heads in one way or another. But Civil War was kind of the crossing the line, right? It was like, we can't, like this is something that we can't necessarily reconcile. And even in the aftermath of Civil War and the launch and going into like the future of New Avengers and things like that, there was a lot of, it was very, very tense the way that it was written by like Bendis and those guys. It was a struggle, right? Trying to find a way to have these two work together because they're so significant in the superhero community, but also put some of their issues aside was always a very difficult thing. And it was one of those things that because of the way that Marvel had written these characters, whether they were on the same team or they were somehow teaming up in their own individual books, it was always done in such a way to where you knew lingering in the background was the massive Civil War event that was caused either by Tony Stark or by Captain America, depending on what side you were on. But the reality here is that you have this whole thing where Captain America's like, we need you to basically step in and to in effect use your mind in order to help Europe basically liberate itself, right? To become free of its dictator that's running the whole show. Only you can really pull this off, Tony Stark. And so in the end, when Tony's like, okay, like where are we going? Like what's going on? Ultimately, Captain America says, there's something I need to show you. And when he basically pulls back the shrubbery and whatnot and shows Tony Stark what it is that he wanted to show him, it's Apocalypse and his horsemen. And it's like, hello, Iron Man. And literally Tony Stark goes to like try to escape, try to offer a distraction. But at the end of the day, he's snatched up by Dracula. And that's the crazy thing, because now you literally have you have Apocalypse's four horsemen, which is composed of some pretty capable guys, Dracula being one of them, which is kind of ironic because in Marvel Comics, Apocalypse fought Dracula at one point in time. Like they're enemies, right? They're enemies. But at the end of the day, again, there's no real enemies versus enemies anymore. Now it's just people trying to survive. Not only that, is like Iron Man is trying to like fight off and he tells Captain America, you have to get Dracula off of me. The response of Captain America is no. And then he knocks Tony Stark unconscious. And so in essence, it looks like Steve Rogers has betrayed Tony Stark, only for us to find out it's not Steve Rogers, it's Mystique pretending to be Steve Rogers. And that was amazing. Like I never saw that coming. I had no idea that was the case. I really thought it was Captain America who had turned against Tony Stark. And my thought was, what could have possibly happened that Captain America would betray righteousness and go against Tony Stark? Like literally ally himself with Apocalypse. When would that ever happen? But at the end of the day, of course, Apocalypse, with Tony Stark knocked unconscious, they snatch him up and they teleport away and they bring Tony Stark to Europe. Now, the funny thing about this is that there's a discussion that happens between the two, and this is one of the reasons why I love Apocalypse so much, right? They have this kind of discussion where Tony Stark is woken up by Apocalypse, which one, it's just cool to see Iron Man interacting with Apocalypse because you never really see that happen. It's one of the things that I love when it comes to like these crazy kind of out there what if stories where like you never really see, you see characters basically cross paths and interact where they usually never do. And seeing Tony Stark talking with Apocalypse is just cool, man. It's just cool. But ultimately, like Apocalypse is like, you need to see things on my, from my perspective. Like you need to basically be on my side here. In the end, like I only thought mutants were the ones worth saving, but it turns out you caught my attention because of your intelligence, like you shall work for me. And the response of Tony Stark is like, no, like I'm not gonna work for a guy who makes slaves build statues out of them. And then Apocalypse makes this amazing counter argument. He says, and were your Iron Man suits not partly shining tributes to yourself? Were the metals not mined by slaves in other lands? You understand as I do, Stark, evolution uses and kills the inferior and undeserving. There can be no progress with our world rendered stagnant. It is time to evolve again. And that's when you end up finding out that people working for Apocalypse are some bigger people. Riri Williams, right? The girl who basically reverse engineered Iron Man's own technology and created her own Iron Man suit. Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four. These guys are allied with Apocalypse. Not only that, Apocalypse has basically found a way to start creating electricity again. He basically created what's called a Faraday cage, right? Which is immune to the constant EMP. But every single cage that Iron Man has tried to build has ultimately failed. That he's used adamantium, vibranium, the electromagnetic pulse in the earth is simply just too strong. And he says you need, some kind of force that's equally as strong to repel it. And that's when Iron Man realizes at the center of this Faraday cage emitting this magnetic pulse, or basically countering the electromagnetic pulse, is Magneto. That in essence, Apocalypse got his hands on Magneto and now he's forcing him to operate inside this cage. The other thing here is we end up learning all these people who are working for Apocalypse are not doing so willingly. That while Tony Stark is slightly distracted, he realizes the Purple Man is there. And that's when Apocalypse says, take his mind. And the Purple Man does that, seizes control of Tony Stark. And that's basically what's happened with everybody. And so as it ends, or at least as this issue ends, Apocalypse has, as you guys know, Apocalypse makes like the best monologue, has the best statements. He literally says, I touched the mind of a being more powerful than a god. Then the earth stopped and the being slept. I want that power. You're going to help me wake the Unmaker, Tony Stark. And Apocalypse simply just walks away. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. I love Dark Ages. It's just ridiculously good. It's just a ridiculously good story. Like I said, I blew through this thing in an hour and a half. But thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.